Hello, let's have a look at the two main selection statements, if statements and switch statements. But before we do that, let's talk about what selection even means. So sequence, selection, and iteration are three terms you've got to be on the lookout for. These are what OCR might describe as programming constructs. They are essentially the three fundamental building blocks of procedural programs. We've also got recursion as kind of a fourth thing, but these are the three kind of basic fundamental ones. Sequence is our simplest. It's just where our program has got code which runs from top to bottom with no skipping or repeating lines. So if you've got two or more lines back to back which run no matter what, that is a block of sequence code. But of course, we often want more complex programs. So selection, which can also be called branching, is where we have decisions being made which will choose which lines of code to run. And iteration, also called looping, is where you might have some lines being repeated. Now, programs would typically have a mix of these three constructs. Here is some OCR pseudocode, and we've got iteration. We've got a for loop being used. Inside it, we've got a little bit of sequence code because those two lines will run no matter what. I've also got some selection with an if statement. So these are three building blocks. They're used together, used in combination, and you've got to be able to recognize which concept is which. So here, if statements are selection, a for loop is iteration. Now, we've got in this code here an example of some nesting going on. Nesting is when one construct is used inside another construct. So here, we've got an if statement inside a for loop. We've got sequence inside a for loop. That's nesting. We've nested the if statement inside that loop. Now, in OCR pseudocode, actually, they don't need to indent it, and you don't need to indent it if you are writing pseudocode as your answer. If you are writing Python code, you have got to indent it. But because we've got things like endif and nextI, which tell us we're finished with that block of code, actually indents are not necessary. Now, I think you'll agree, even ignoring the colors, like that is a lot less clear when it has no indentation. So make sure you're still indenting. It's more readable when we have indentation. And the thing we're indenting is stuff inside the block of code. So if statements, like I say, are one of our two main ways we can implement selection. Here is some code with the if statement highlighted in blue. It's got a fairly simple syntax, which I'm sure you'd recognize. The code inside the if statement will run if the condition is true. So here, the subject has to be CS and homework done has to be equal to no for this print line to run. This print thank you will run no matter what because it's outside of this if statement. We can also add additional parts to these if statements called clauses. These are optional, but we may want to add these. Else if allows us to check for additional conditions, which the else if only runs if previous ones were false, and else runs if all previous conditions were false. So to look at that as an example, if I say got a score by some miracle of 95, we first of all check the first condition. That condition is true, therefore we run that print line, and it will skip the rest of the if statement. If I got a score of 60, we check the first condition. That's not true. So we go to the next one. That's also not true. We go to the next one. That's also not true. But this one is true because 60 is greater than or equal to 60. Therefore, this one is true. And we run this grade D line of code, but we still skip the rest of it because we don't run the else unless all of it was false. So a circumstance when else might run might be if I get, say, 17 in the test. All of these conditions are false, therefore the else runs as a default and we get grade F outputted. Now, 99% of the time we are using if statements when we are trying to implement selection. However, there is another poor forgotten about statement which also implements selection, and you could be showing this in code because it is in the OCR pseudocode set. These are called switch statements, and they are very similar in approach to an if statement. The code only runs if the different cases match exactly the value of a variable. And this means they're kind of a little bit more limited than an if statement. And let me try and explain this. So here is our syntax of a switch statement. If we look at the sort of opening and end line, the end line is just end switch like we have end if. Here we start with switch like we start with if, but we don't have a condition like we have with an if statement. We have a variable. And this is the variable we are trying to compare against. It can be any variable. It just happens to be the one I have set here. So no condition, also no then. Weirdly, they use colons here, a bit inconsistent, but there we go. Inside the switch statement, we have what are effectively conditions. So here we've got these different cases, and each one is kind of like a condition. Now, they're not written as conditions, just says case sunny, case rainy. But what switch is doing is comparing that variable to that item there, to that case, I guess we could say. So really it's going, here it's the equivalent of going if weather is equal to sunny. That is what that is effectively doing behind the scenes, just written in a slightly more concise way. So if you are doing direct comparisons and you've got a bunch of direct comparisons, switch statements can be a little bit more concise than if statements. And then we've got a default case at the bottom. That is like else. So the default case is effectively the equivalent of else. That runs if none of the other cases were true. So if I typed in snowy when I entered the weather, it's going to go through each case one by one and compare it to what was typed in. So snowy isn't equal to sunny, that doesn't run. Snowy isn't equal to rainy, that doesn't run. Snowy is equal to snowy, therefore this line of code runs and it skips the rest of the switch statement. And if I typed in, I don't know, cold, well, first case isn't matching, neither is the second one, neither is the third one, neither is the fourth one. So therefore the default case runs and we get, I don't recognize that weather outputted. So if you're coming across switches for the first time, not worth you trying to force yourself to use these, because if you know if statements really well, stick to those. However, you could be shown this code in the exam. Hopefully you understand how this works. If not, give it a go. There's a link in the description to try writing OCR pseudocode. You might want to try it yourself and make sure you understand how it fully works.